The news of Val Kilmer's death shocked everyone, but fans weren't ready for what they found out afterward. As Hollywood mourned the loss of one of its biggest stars, an unsettling document came to light: his autopsy report. Inside were details so shocking and unexpected that they made everyone wonder what really happened in his last days. The truth lies quietly behind the tributes and movie montages, not the story the headlines told you. Stay tuned, because what's in that report will shock you. Hollywood is sad about Val Kilmer's sudden death on April 1, 2025. Val Kilmer, the famous actor best known for his unforgettable roles in Top Gun, Batman Forever, and The Doors, died at the age of 65 due to complications from pneumonia, according to the official statement. But as the news spread on social media and fans paid tribute, something felt missing from the story. The tributes started coming in almost right away, with director Michael Mann, who worked with Kilmer on Heat, calling him a brilliant, unpredictable force who left an indelible mark on every scene he touched. Josh Brolin also shared a heartfelt message. "See you soon, friend. You were a brave, artistic, and explosive person." Even the official Top Gun account expressed sadness over the death of their beloved Iceman, writing, "A legend on and off screen, Val Kilmer, you'll be missed." Actors, filmmakers, musicians, they all joined the chorus of grief. Posted a black and white photo of Kilmer as Doc Holliday in Tombstone, while director Francis Ford Coppola remembered him as a natural talent that deepened with age. Some messages were long, some were short, but they all carried the same undertone: shock, sadness, and a shared sense that this loss came too soon. And yet, beyond the flowers, the statements, and the media retrospectives, there were whispers the public had known Val Kilmer was unwell for years. He fought a long, visible battle with throat cancer, a battle he finally went public about in 2017 after years of speculation and denial. Fans watched him lose his voice, struggle to breathe, and eventually disappear from the spotlight, except for one final powerful appearance in Top Gun Maverick. But even then, when he returned to the screen with the help of voice AI and creative film, many sensed it was a farewell. Still, when news of his death broke, most people assumed it was the long-term damage from his cancer treatment that finally caught up with him. It wasn't a surprise that he died of pneumonia in a weak body. What was surprising was what happened in the days after his death. Tributes kept coming in, and media outlets played endless highlight reels of Kilmer's best parts. Behind closed doors, a different conversation started in silence. His close friends, old co-workers, and even family members began to say that they hadn't known how bad things were. There were rumors that Val Kilmer had been withdrawing more and more in the months before his death, ignoring calls, visitors, and offers of help. Year without it ever making the news. And why? Even though the official cause of death was pneumonia, there was a delay in releasing his full autopsy report. At first, these questions were lost in the flood of tributes, but a few reporters kept digging. There were rumors that the autopsy revealed disturbing details that went far beyond what anyone expected, details that suggested Kilmer's final chapter might have been even darker than the public knew. For now, while the world mourned, fans watched their favorite Val Kilmer movies. The headlines said how he died, but the real story was buried in the fine print of his final medical report. When it finally came out, it shocked everyone. Val Kilmer, a Hollywood legend, had the ability to illuminate the screen and blend into a character like few others. He was also a man who was surrounded by rumors, friction, and mystery long before his death. Val Kilmer's rise was quick and unforgettable. Born in Los Angeles in 1959, he was a California kid who got interested in the arts early on. At the time, he was the youngest person ever accepted into Juilliard's prestigious drama program. From there, it didn't take long for Hollywood to call. His big break came in Top Secret in 1984, a comedy that showed he could switch between charm and chaos. But it was Top Gun in 1986 that made him famous as Tom Iceman. Kilmer stole scenes from Tom Cruise with ease, playing the cool, cocky rival who somehow became the heart of the story. From there his career exploded. He slipped effortlessly into roles like Jim Morrison in The Doors, a performance so uncanny even Morrison's bandmates were stunned, and Doc Holliday in Tombstone, where his portrayal of the Southern gunslinger became legendary. He became Batman in Batman Forever, one of the highest grossing films of the 90s, though that role came with baggage of its own, because as his star power grew, so did the rumors about Val Kilmer being difficult. Stories from movie sets began to swirl. Directors called him demanding, unpredictable, even combative. On the chaotic set of The Island of Dr. Moreau, Kilmer clashed so badly with the crew and fellow actors that one director walked off the job. Joel Schumacher, who directed him in Batman Forever, bluntly called him psychologically troubled and said he was the most challenging actor he'd worked with. Kilmer pushed back against these claims later, saying he was misunderstood, a perfectionist who wanted to dive deep into his roles and wasn't afraid to speak his mind. But the damage to his reputation lingered for a time. In the early 2000s he became less bankable, less visible, and quietly retreated from the front lines of Hollywood. Still, there was something about Kilmer that made him magnetic, even when the press painted him as temperamental. Directors kept casting him, fans kept watching. There was always a sense that beneath the public persona there was a man wrestling with something much bigger than the roles he played. And then came the illness. When whispers began around 2014 that Kilmer's health was failing, he stayed silent. His noticeable weight loss because of his raspy voice. The cancelled shows, none of it was addressed publicly. For years he denied reports of cancer, even when friends and fans noticed something was clearly wrong. It wasn't until 2017 that Kilmer finally admitted it. He had been fighting throat cancer, a battle he had kept hidden, while quietly undergoing chemotherapy, radiation, and eventually a tracheotomy that robbed him of his natural voice. Fans admired his honesty when he finally spoke about it. They celebrated his resilience when he appeared in public again, frail but smiling, and when he returned as Iceman and Top Gun Maverick. They took it as a victory, a comeback moment. But here's the thing, the more you looked back at Kilmer's life, the more you realized how much he'd kept from the world. A career filled with unforgettable roles, yes, but also years of tension, secrecy, and silence about what was really happening behind the scenes. And it wasn't just during his career, because what no one knew then, what even his family and closest friends couldn't have seen coming, was that his need to hide, to protect his privacy at all costs, wouldn't stop when he got sick or lost his job. It would follow him all the way to the end. What was found after he died would be the most upsetting part of his story, not what was in the papers or in interviews. The silent fight, Kilmer's long, quiet battle with cancer. Val Kilmer's public life looked like a highlight reel, red carpets, blockbuster films, interviews where he flashed that trademark smirk. But behind the headlines and the camera flashes, Kilmer was fighting a battle he refused to talk about, a battle that by the time the world found out had already cost him almost everything. It began quietly. Around 2014 fans started to notice something different about him. He looked thinner, weaker, his voice sounded rough and hoarser. During public appearances there were cancelled events, reports of hospitalization, and blurry photos of him looking frail. Rumors swirled that he was seriously ill, but every time the press asked, Kilmer denied it. He insisted he was fine even when he clearly wasn't. It wasn't until 2017 that the truth finally came out. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Kilmer confirmed what many had suspected. He had been diagnosed with throat cancer. He had spent the past 3 years undergoing radiation, chemotherapy, and a tracheotomy that permanently altered his ability to speak. He downplayed it in typical Kilmer fashion, joking about his raspy voice and claiming he was doing well, but the truth was more complicated. The treatments had saved his life, but they had taken almost everything else. His once strong voice, which was heard in movies like The Doors and Tombstone, had been lowered to a weak, breathy whisper. His health was bad, and it was hard for him to breathe. For someone who had spent decades in front of the camera, this was a private hell, but Kilmer didn't want to be pitted. Instead, he tried to change the story? In 2021, he released a deeply personal documentary called Val, which he made with the help of his children. The film used decades of home video footage and voiceover narration to tell his story, from his childhood to his rise in Hollywood to his battle with cancer. It was raw, honest, and at times uncomfortable to watch, and audiences saw not the polished star but the fragile man behind the fame for many fans. Val was a release and a chance to finally understand the man who had been hiding behind characters and headlines for so long. The documentary didn't show everything because Kilmer was open about his illness but kept some things private. Friends, family, and even doctors would later say they didn't fully understand that he had won the cancer battle. That's what the headline said, and that he was in remission. People who knew him well knew that remission didn't mean he was safe. The tracheotomy had left him permanently open to harm. He lived a quiet life in Los Angeles, focused on his art, his family, and small independent projects. His immune system was weak, and he had trouble breathing, eating, and speaking every day. Despite the physical damage, signs of a deeper issue were evident. He no longer resembled the Val Kilmer people remembered, and despite the encouraging news about his recovery, his health continued to deteriorate. By the time he was in his last few months, even those closest to him admitted that he wasn't reaching out for help or letting anyone see how awful things had gotten. The world thought Kilmer's battle was over when he beat cancer, but what no one knew was that the scars of that battle went much deeper than anyone knew. And those scars would come back to the surface in the most unexpected and disturbing way after he was gone. When Maverick returned in Top Gun in 2022, it felt like a moment had been captured forever. It had been almost 40 years since the movie that made him famous, and there he was again. Tom Iceman Kazansky stood next to Tom Cruise's Maverick, but this time there was something different and fragile behind the cool exterior. By the time Maverick came out in theaters, everyone knew Kilmer's voice was permanently damaged. His battle with throat cancer was no longer a secret. What many people didn't know was how hard producers Cruise and Kilmer himself worked to get him back on screen at all. Kilmer's health was declining, he couldn't speak properly, and simple scenes were a physical challenge, but he wanted to do it not just for the fans but for himself. It was a chance to close the loop on a character that had in many ways defined his career. The filmmakers used a mix of creative techniques to bring Iceman back to life. They leaned on text messages in the story, had Iceman communicate by typing, and when he finally spoke it was brief, a few simple words, but even those few lines carried weight because they weren't just coming from Iceman, they were coming from Kilmer himself. What the audience heard in that scene wasn't entirely his real voice, it was a blend of his actual speech and cutting-edge AI voice technology. Kilmer had worked with a software company to digitally recreate his voice based on archival recordings. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to remind the world of the voice they had missed. When the movie premiered, the reaction was immediate. Fans around the world were moved to tears. Critics praised the scene as one of the most emotional moments in the film. It wasn't about the dialogue, it was about what it represented: a man who had lost everything returning for one last bow. But off-screen things were less polished. Those who worked on the film later admitted how hard the process had been. Kilmer's physical condition was fragile. Every day on set was a struggle. The scenes were carefully staged to minimize how much he had to speak or move, and when the cameras stopped rolling, Kilmer would quietly retreat exhausted. After the film's release, Kilmer did a few interviews and public appearances, but it was clear he was fading from the spotlight. He spent most of his time at home surrounded by his children and close friends, focusing on painting and writing. Fans believed they had witnessed a comeback, a triumphant return of a legend, but what most people missed was the real message behind that Maverick scene: that it wasn't a comeback, it was a farewell. In many ways, Kilmer's appearance in Maverick served as a carefully crafted goodbye. He gave the audience closure, but behind the scenes he was already slipping away. His health was deteriorating faster than anyone realized, and while fans celebrated the return of Iceman, Kilmer quietly disappeared from public life once again. The scene was emotional, powerful, and for many heartbreaking, but it wasn't the full story, because what no one watching that movie could have imagined was that Kilmer's true final chapter wouldn't play out on the big screen. It would unfold months after he was gone in a report for all the headlines, box office numbers, and famous parts. No one was ready to read about the family, fame, and loneliness in her personal life. Val Kilmer spent decades in the public eye, but his personal life was rarely shown. The man behind the camera remained a mystery, and as the years went by, that mystery grew. Kilmer's love life, like much of his career, was a mix of intensity and turbulence. In 1988, at the height of his rising fame, he married Joanne Whalley, a British actress he met on the set of Willow. The two seemed like the perfect couple, young, talented, and beautiful. They had 2 children together. Mercedes was born in 1991 and Jack in 1995, but fame and personal issues took a toll. By 1996, they were mostly divorced and living apart. Biggest source of pride. They were in his documentary Val, and it was clear that they had become his emotional anchor after years of ups and downs in Hollywood. But Kilmer's personal relationships were rocky outside of his role as a dad. He was linked to a number of famous women over the years: Cindy Crawford, Daryl Hannah, and even Angelina Jolie, while Alexander was being filmed. The tabloids loved the stories, but Kilmer rarely acknowledged or talked about these relationships. In his younger years, he kept his personal life very private. As he got older, that modesty changed into something else. Kilmer's world shrunk after he was diagnosed with cancer. His health problems made him withdraw from public life, but it wasn't just physically. His friends and family noticed that he wasn't letting people in like he used to. Invitations went unanswered, calls went unanswered, and he spent long periods of time alone at home in Los Angeles, mostly with his art, journals, and memories. Some of that was understandable. Cancer and its treatments had left him physically and emotionally worn out. His voice was a whisper, his body frail. Public appearances were exhausting, but even in private, Kilmer seemed to be closing himself off. In his own words, he described himself as a deeply spiritual person, someone who believed in signs, symbols, and the greater meaning of life, but that belief also made him fiercely protective of his space. He didn't want sympathy, he didn't want to be seen as a victim. That protective instinct, though, came with a cost. Friends later admitted that in the last year of his life, Kilmer became harder to reach. He wasn't responding to messages, he avoided gatherings. Even some family members said they hadn't seen him in months before his death. To the outside world, it looked like a man living quietly, recovering from illness, but to those who knew him best, there were growing concerns. Was he struggling more than he let on? Was he hiding something, or had the years of fighting, first in Hollywood, then with his health, simply worn him down? When news of his death broke, those closest to him were devastated but not entirely surprised. They had seen the signs of decline, the growing silence, the damage to the body. Nobody knew what the final official report about his death would say, because it was buried beneath the tributes and news stories. It was a truth that painted a much more disturbing picture of Kilmer's last months, and when it came out, it made even those closest to him question how well they really knew Val Kilmer. More disturbing details came out after Val Kilmer's death. The world mourned and moved on. His movies were streamed, his interviews were rewatched, and his legacy as Iceman was honored. It seemed like the story had come to an end. A beloved actor had died too soon after years of health problems. But then came the document that no one thought would make headlines. At first look, Val Kilmer's autopsy report confirmed what everyone already knew. Pneumonia made an already weak body even weaker, but details hidden deeper in the report painted a much scarier picture. It wasn't the cause of death that shocked people, it was everything else. The coroner's report noted signs of severe malnutrition. In Kilmer's final months, his weight had dropped well below what was considered healthy for his height and age. There were clear indicators of muscle wasting, something doctors described as common in terminal illnesses, but in this case unusually advanced. It raised an uncomfortable question: had he stopped eating? Had he given up? But that wasn't all. There were also mentions of multiple untreated infections, minor at first but left unrest long enough to cause further strain on his weakened immune system. According to the report, these infections could have been easily treated had they been caught earlier. It seemed Kilmer either hadn't noticed or hadn't told anyone. Even more concerning were the notes about chronic surgical wounds that had not fully healed, some dating back to his earlier cancer surgeries. There were signs of ongoing physical stress and neglect. The report mentioned that in the months before his death he had been refusing medical care, opting to stay at home despite clear signs that he needed help. And then there were the toxicology results. While there was no trace of illegal substances or overdose, the report confirmed high levels of prescription pain medication in his system, not enough to kill him, but enough to suggest he'd been living in considerable unmanaged pain. The official language in the report was clinical cold, but the message was clear. Val Kilmer hadn't just died from pneumonia, he had been quietly deteriorating physically and mentally for far longer than anyone around him realized. When the details hit the news, headlines everywhere repeated the same phrase: disturbing details found in Val Kilmer's autopsy report. And they weren't exaggerating, because the real shock wasn't that he died, it was how much he had suffered in silence, how much he had hidden from everyone, his fans, his friends, even his family. It seemed Kilmer had spent his final months the same way he had lived much of his life, protecting his privacy at all costs, shielding the world from his pain even when it was eating him alive. In the end, the autopsy revealed more than just the cause of death. It exposed the weight of what he carried alone, the unspoken struggles, the neglected wounds, the quiet descent no one saw coming. And that's the part of Val Kilmer's story no one will ever forget. What do you think drives someone to hide their suffering so well that even those closest to them don't see it? Pride, privacy, or something far deeper?